Well, wonderful. Thank you all so much for coming out to our Coexisting with Carnivores conversation night. This is a great turnout. Really appreciate you all taking a couple hours out of your evening to come learn more about black bears, coyotes here in our community around Issaquah, and we'll talk about stuff reaching out a little further than Issaquah tonight too. So want to introduce myself. It's great that I see a lot of familiar faces, but I definitely don't know everyone here tonight. So my name is Dan Hintz. I'm the Urban Forest Supervisor with the City of Issaquah within our Parks and Community Services Department. I'll introduce the rest of our panel here in a second, but I just also want to call out some of the really awesome partners taking some time out of their night to come out and table and provide information. Hopefully you all already have learned some stuff chatting with the folks we have tabling here, and a lot of them are overlapping with the panelists too. But we have our City of Issaquah, Green Issaquah Park Ranger program. We have a survey open for our urban forest management plan that the city's developing here. So please check that out. Come chat with me, our park ranger, Alex, and then our two Gibson interns, Mina and Leilani, have been holding down our table. They're in the back there. Thank you, you two. We have Snoqualmie Tribes, Ancestral Lands Movement. So please come hi, say hi to Sarah over there and chat more about that. And then we have Friends of Lake Sammamish State Park. We have Sarah and Jessica over there. They're actually looking at starting their own camera trap team here in the next year or so and looking for volunteers and also a ton of other good ways to engage with them. We have Lauren and Joey from Recology in the corner there. If you want to see, touch, kind of learn more about bear-resistant trash cans. I just learned that there also exists bear-resistant compost bins too. So stuff that really important to have if you live in those areas where our critters come and wander through your yards and driveways. And then we have Woodland Park Zoo. So we have Katie on our panel. I'll introduce a little bit more, then Brianna in the back there. They've been instrumental in helping us put this event together. So big thanks to Woodland Park Zoo, and we'll chat a little bit more about their history working with Coexisting with Carnivores, which is actually a really neat program that came out of Issaquah Middle School about 10 years ago. So Katie, I think we'll have a little bit more information on that. So really excited to have you here. We're really focusing on black bears and coyotes tonight. We'll probably touch a little bit on some other wildlife or other carnivores, but that is really the focus. We're going to get into the kind of annual cycles and biology of coyotes, starting with Sam Krelling here first. So we'll kick off with Sam here in a second. Sam is a PhD student, correct? At the Peru lab at University of Washington. As you can see on the slide, researching specifically urban coyotes and their diet and coexistence. So we'll kick off with Sam, then we'll hand it off to Kevin O'Connor with Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, who works with a lot of different carnivores, but we'll focus on black bears tonight, also kind of talking about their biology, annual cycles of activity, all of that stuff. And then I will be presenting briefly on kind of the work we're doing in City of Issaquah, a little bit more like habitat related. So that's land conservation and acquisition, habitat restoration, kind of looking at connectivity for wildlife. If there's some areas of the city I think we can really grow there too, and I'm hoping that's a good segue for Ezekiel Roloff, who's the wildlife biologist with the Snoqualmie Indian tribe. So he will be kind of talking a little bit more about, the perspective of working with wildlife with the Snoqualmie tribe, and also, kind of this really big need for wildlife connectivity, crossings, all of that really awesome stuff, talking about some of the really good conservation restoration work that the Snoqualmie tribe is doing too. And then we'll round it out with coexistence and calls for action, how you can get involved, how you can be good neighbors and, sharing this space with our carnivores. And that will be Katie Remine with Woodland Park Zoo, chatting about that and a little bit the Seattle Urban Carnivore Project. And then our City of Issaquah Park Ranger, Alex Anderson, will wrap us up with some more coexistent tips. So we're doing our best to keep these presentations each individually. These are kind of little micro presentations. There'll be 6 of them to 5 to 10 minutes. We received a lot of questions for you folks that signed up and sent them in advance. We're trying to incorporate those into presentations. We're probably not going to get to all of them, but we hope to have a little time for kind of a full group question and answer at the end. And then, I think most of our panelists can stick around until 7:30, hopefully. And, hopefully if you're interested in chat and learning a little bit more, you can have some kind of quick one-on-one conversations. We'll have the tables and all that stuff set up till 7:30 too. So feel free to hang out. A few just things to consider. Hopefully you know us already. Bathrooms in the back there. There's coffee, water, a few things in the kitchen there. If you're looking for some refreshments, feel free. If you need to take a little break, step outside, any of that sort of stuff. We won't be offended if you need to get up, move around a little bit over the next hour. So yeah, once again, really, really excited to have you all here. This was a really awesome turnout for this event, and I'm going to hand it over to Sam to kick us off. Thank you, Sam.
Yes, Sam.
Hi, I'm Sam. So I study urban coyotes in the greater Seattle area, predominantly in our more urban areas, but I also do work out here and in Renton and all over the place. So this is a sign that I saw out on Mercer Island. You'll see this in a lot of different places. These coyotes are killing pets. They're gonna eat our kids, things like that. So I'm here to assure you that that is not all that they're here for. And we can actually benefit from their existence in our areas. Cool. Here we go. All right, so a little bit about me. I'm a fourth-year PhD candidate in the Peru Lab at the University of Washington. This is my dog, Issaquah, who was pretty instrumental in collecting a lot of my samples. So to start off, I thought we'd go over what a coyote is. There's a lot of misconceptions on kind of the basic ecology of coyotes. For one, they're actually pretty small. So while they look like the size of a golden retriever, my dog is 80 pounds and a coyote only gets up to about 30 pounds. So they're quite small. They are in the dog family, so they're very closely related to dogs and wolves. They are omnivorous, so most people think that they just eat meat, but they actually eat a ton of fruit and vegetation. So in the summers, I would estimate probably 50 or 60% of their diet's probably fruit. So that can be from your trees, that can be salmon berry that they're getting out of creeks, all sorts of stuff. There we go. And they're everywhere. So it's pretty hard to get rid of coyotes. The US has literally tried for about 200 years and we have failed. They've actually expanded by over 50% of their rate. So we're gonna have to live with them. And I think there's a lot of reasons that we should want to live with them. They're a really important ecosystem component. So they help control a lot of our prey base, our invasive rabbits and things like that, as well as spread and disperse seeds of our native plants. Okay, come on. And they're a species that's really thriving in this era of kind of mass conservation concern where we have all these animals going extinct or are endangered. These are kind of like a bright shining light of things that are really doing well. So that's why I study them. Otherwise I'd be depressed and sad.
Sorry.
Oh, there we go. Okay, so like I said, coyotes have expanded. They've basically doubled their range in the last 100 years or so. Large part of this is because we got rid of large carnivores like wolves. So coyotes are able to fill those niches. They're able to use those resources that our larger carnivores would have been using instead. So we got none of those guys. And then we've also modified the landscape a lot. So whether that be taking out forests or building farms or building cities, coyotes have learned to kind of use and actually kind of benefit from these different modifications to the landscape. So for urban coyotes, there are a few differences from kind of their rural counterparts. They tend to be a bit bolder. There we go. They have a lot more varied diet because they're not just eating their natural prey anymore. They're also eating the stuff that we throw away or leave out on the streets. Come on. They are behaviorally plastic, which means that they can change their behavior to whatever suits them. So they're very adaptable, very capable of living around people. And they also live in much higher densities in urban areas. So this means that they have smaller home ranges and there's going to be more of them when you have more people around. Basically because we leave food out for them and they can have more babies. So in Seattle, and probably likely applies to places around here, they've been in the area since about the 50s, we think. We don't quite know. They can be found in pretty much every green space that exists. Their populations likely aren't increasing. They're probably pretty stable. They'll fluctuate with prey and whatnot, but because of all the human resources, they're probably relatively stable. Oh, that last one was they also help control pest populations. So we're going to go through kind of what it looks like to be a coyote. So first off, they are relatively monogamous. They will mate for successive years. Dads are really involved in raising the pups, which is quite rare in the animal world. They will den in late spring. This is when we see the most conflict happening. They will have 4 to 7 pups on average, but it can be way more, up to like 15. And they have a really high parental care level. So they are really caring about their pups. This is often where that conflict starts to arise. They are fiercely protective of their pups, and they don't want things like dogs, which they're really closely related to, coming near their pups because they see it as a threat. So very cute, right? This is anyone who studied coyotes will tell you because they're cool, but also because they're super cute. So the pups will stay in their dens around May or June for about 6 weeks. Parents will become empty nesters generally around 6 to 9 months, sometimes later than that, but usually in fall and early winter. Oh my gosh, sorry. And then pups will disperse and they will find their own territories, basically. But when you have all these pups, that is a lot of mouths to feed. And this is one of the reasons that we start to see conflict happening. In most urban areas, they're going to be eating lots of rats and rodents and rabbits and things like that, but they will occasionally take domestic pets. Kind of happens a lot during this denning season as well, because they're going to be hanging out around their den and then getting anything that's kind of nearby. They're very opportunistic. Oh, can you go back for me, please?
Yes, I think
Sorry.
there's a little delay between,
Yeah. So in family structure, they typically live in groups, but they can also be solitary. They don't usually tolerate non-family members within their territories. So that's why when you have a family group there, it's actually kind of good. They're keeping out potentially more conflict-related individuals away. So if you have a family group you can live with, you want to keep that family group around. And so if you end up removing these family members, you create all of these resources that a new family group is just going to move right into. So like I was saying, they can see domestic dogs as a threat. They'll often escort or kind of follow dogs. They're not trying to hunt the dogs. They're just trying to get them away from their dens. They'll do this with people as well. So you'll hear a lot of people say, oh, I was stalked by a coyote. They were not stalked by a coyote. They were escorted by a coyote. That coyote is just saying, hey, you're too close. Please go away. And they're going to make sure that you are sufficiently far from their den. Like I was saying, that denning time is our period of most frequent conflict. They're protecting their pups that aren't moving around from the den a whole lot. So that's when we're going to see these conflicts arise, both with people and with dogs. And you may see behaviors like that escorting. You might see barking as well, and then chasing dogs off. But that's all completely normal behavior. So all of that totally normal. When it gets abnormal is when you start having them actively attacking pets on leash. Rare, but does happen. If they're actually touching or approaching people, that's not a good sign. Usually a sign that they've been fed by people. Of course, if they're biting people, that's not a good thing. Happens very rarely, but again, usually because they've been habituated and they're used to getting food from people. And then if you see kind of this begging activity, that's usually another sign that they're being fed. So often individuals become emboldened, not whole family groups. Typically, this is from habituation. So if you're feeding a coyote, it starts associating people with food, and they're just going to start hanging around a lot more often. And attacks are exceedingly rare. So between 1977 and 2015, there were only 367 coyote attacks in the US, compared to 4.7 million people being bitten by domestic dogs annually. So quite a big difference. So you should really be afraid of your neighbor's dog much more than a coyote is walking around your neighborhood. And few studies have really counted like the number of domestic pets that they take, but it's likely far fewer than we end up thinking it is. So that gets to my study. I studied coyotes. To look at what they're actually eating, we use genetics. The thing that people usually want to know is how many domestic animals that they're eating. Unfortunately, I can't tell you how many dogs they're eating because coyotes and dogs are so closely related that they actually share the same genetic marker at this point. But I can tell you about cats. So in general, okay, there we go. Most studies find about 1 to 2% of their diet is going to be cats in urban areas. There's like one study, there's one study in LA that estimated that 20% of scats have cats in them, but that is not how much of their diet is cats. So you think of a cat is a big meal and probably shared among a family. So they're all going to be pooping it out for days. So if you're picking up all that poop, you're going to find it in a lot of them. In Seattle, we have kind of like preliminary data here of 264 of our kind of first samples. 50 of them came back with some level of cat DNA in it. Only 15% of these had significant levels. So things that I don't think would be like contamination. And of these 15, one ended up being from a bobcat. So that takes us down to only 14 scats. Now, this is a very small sample size, and when we up this sample size, it gets a little bit bigger. But if you look at when these were all collected and where they're collected, they're all kind of coming from the same points of time, which means instead of 15 different cats, it's probably 3 or 4 spread out across these sampling points. And I think that oh, you go back one more.
Yeah.
Sorry. But what they are mainly eating is rabbits. It makes sense, they're everywhere, right? We also have some small voles and rats. We have lots of fruits, so our kind of like fruit trees like plums, as well as native fruits and things like dog food as well, and the occasional raccoon and bald eagle even. But while there are some reasons to fear coyotes, with our pets, for the most part, I think they can actually really help us. So ecosystem services are these benefits that we gain from having animals and biodiversity in our ecosystems. For coyotes, if we think about our little urban area, they're eating our pest animals, mainly our rats and our rodents that are causing diseases, are chewing up wires and starting fires, things like that. But the coyote eats those, so it helps us control and mitigate those negative effects of these prey species. On the other side, they're eating tons of native fruit, or even fruit that we find nice, like apple trees. And they're pooping that out and dispersing it for us. So we may even benefit from them on kind of a vegetarian level as well. And I think that should be it, right? There we go. If you guys have any questions, I do have this email, so be able to. We're going to do questions at the end.
I think we'll save questions for the end. Yeah, thank you so much. How are people doing temperature wise? We have that door open. I don't know if we're getting a little bit of a draft in here. If we want to, people are doing good. Yeah, let us know if someone wants to close that. Okay, next we have Kevin O'Connor. We'll be chatting about black bears.
Yeah, I think
Okay.
so, yeah. Yeah, no, it's beautiful. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, we'll just skip that one. Yeah.
It's all in the model. Let's go.
Yeah. So, hey, good evening, everyone. I'm Kevin O'Connor. I am the wildlife conflict specialist for King and Snohomish counties. My primary duties are responding to any human wildlife concerns where any geographic space where humans and wildlife overlap. What that primarily consists of are bears and trash, elk in commercial crop fields, and livestock and cougars. So I'm primary on responding to most of those incidents or human wildlife conflict encounters throughout King and Snohomish counties. So I'm just going to talk briefly about black bears today, just give you a quick overview related to black bears in Washington. So black bears are forest generalists. They persist primarily in forested habitats around North America. Black bears, grizzlies, wolves, most cougars, a lot of the large carnivores were historically extirpated from North America, significantly reducing the population and their range. Here you could see the historic range of black bear, going all the way down to Florida and through central Mexico there. Conservation efforts, the populations of black bear and other large carnivore species are recovering, and they're doing really well. With human expansion and these recovering populations, we really see quite a significant overlap between humans and wildlife. Big shout out to a lot of these species. They are really learning to coexist with us. And, part of my job is providing public education to people to learn how to coexist alongside them as well. So. There we go. Yeah, so we like to say that Washington is bear country. Pretty much any forested area of Washington state has black bear. There are 2 grizzly bear recovery areas, one up in Northeast Washington, which is the Selkirk recovery area, and then the North Cascade recovery area from the Canadian border down to almost Mount St. Helens area. I'm not from this part. I'm not from this state, so excuse my geography there. But Yeah, black bears, again, are forest generalists. So they will move throughout these forested habitats, looking for different food resources, seasonal food resources, and you could find them pretty much anywhere, anywhere in these areas. Black bears are omnivores. They eat plants, animals, and everything in between. So they will eat, consume berries, nuts, grasses, sedges, as well as native ungulates, especially the young, like deer and elk. They are extremely clever animals, but I like to say they're just as lazy as they are smart. So they are really looking for those easy food resources with a high calorie intake. And so when they are moving around our semi-urban or urban environments, oftentimes that is our trash. They're getting, leftover pizza slices or some donuts that were thrown away. And so that's a very high calorie resource compared to some of the native seasonal grasses and fruits and nuts that are available to them. So why do bears hibernate? We get that question quite a bit. Hibernation is all about energetics and reproduction. The food resources that bears consume is found primarily in the spring, summer, and fall. During the winter, there is not a lot of greenery out there or fruit production. So it's much more energetically efficient to go into hibernation. Bears in Washington typically hibernate from about November to March. So we're just starting to see some bears wake up right now. Typically the males, larger males, will emerge from hibernation first. Females with young will be the last. So reproduction, it's much safer to give birth to young bear cubs in a den setting. You can see here that they are extremely small, very cute. They wean for about 30 days or so. Yeah, so it's much safer and easier for them to give birth in den. Once those cubs are a little bit larger and more mobile, they will emerge and start to move around with their mom. In Western Washington, we find that bears almost exclusively den in the old growth logs or old growth stumps around here. So when you're out hiking and you see these old growths with the old springboard cuts in them, chances are there might be a bear in there. So yeah. So black bears, males typically weigh 150 to 325 pounds, with an average in this state of about 230 pounds. Females weigh between 100 and 180 pounds, with an average of about 140 pounds. I weigh about 170 pounds, so bears look a lot bigger than me, and it's all that fur and just muscle and shape that they have going for them. These weights can vary greatly with access to human food resources. So again, if they have access to pet feed or livestock feed or garbage, this can really increase the fat stores that they have and dramatically increase their weight if that is one of their primary food resources. So black bears come in all different kinds of colors here in Washington and north in the Pacific Northwest. We primarily see the very dark black bears. The coloration or color morph can be associated with habitat. So out in Idaho and down in California, we see a lot of brown or cinnamon color bears, as well as a lot of blondes. The blondes are really cute. They look really funny, almost like they have frosted tips. And yeah, little blonde marshmallows. We also see different blazes, which is the white patch on a bear's chest. All blazes are unique to that individual animal. So when you're out recreating, keep an eye out for your charismatic neighbors. So black bears' feet, paw prints look very similar to ours in that they have 5 toes, and their front paw print is different than their back paw print. So that's one way you could tell, yeah, it's bear moving around. You can see their claw marks. Yeah, I probably won't talk about grizzlies, but another thing to keep an eye out for is scat. And seasonally, you can see what the bears are consuming. So in the spring, it'll be a lot of grasses, different coloration. And then later in the fall, during fruiting, you'll see a lot of seeds, things like that. Also look for overturned rocks. Bears consume quite a lot of grubs and different larval species, wasp nests, things like that, as well as torn apart logs. So keep an eye out for that stuff. And yeah, that's all I got for you today. Just keep it short and sweet. And yeah, happy to answer questions later. So yeah,
Thank you, Kevin.
yeah.
Right, my turn again. Name is Dan Hintz. I'm the urban forest supervisor with the city of Issaquah. So definitely not a wildlife expert, as much as I do love living in these areas, and the rare privilege of coming across these animals is really, really awesome. Something I cherish, where we live here in the world. But my background is definitely more in ecology, forestry, and just going to talk a little bit about how habitat conservation, ways that you all can get involved to restore, advocate for preservation, all those really important things to make sure that we are, being, as I said, good neighbors and providing the habitat and the ability for these animals to hopefully thrive nearby our cities here like Issaquah. So all of the photos that are in this presentation today, or part of my presentation, I should say, are part of Issaquah's camera trap team in partnership with Woodland Park Zoo. So the city has a pretty cool history, actually even before working with the zoo, of having some cameras, and hopefully everyone knows when I say trap, essentially they're catching motion photos. We're not trapping any wildlife, anything like that. So often they are little just quick snapshots, or sometimes little 10-second videos, which I have one or two here in a few slides. So and a lot of these are at Park Point, which I'll talk about briefly. So people around the Issaquah area hopefully are familiar with that. I'll have a little map here later kind of talking about that story, as I think a pretty good success story as it relates to conservation, restoration, and connectivity. Since I'm the tree guy, I guess, I do want to talk briefly. We measure forest in one way as an urban tree canopy. So we are really privileged in Issaquah to have 51% tree canopy within our city boundaries. That's pretty high in the region. It's really cool. It speaks to a lot of the amazing people in this community that have looked at land conservation, had a lot of foresight to make sure we are, smart about the development on the landscape and preserving a lot of these forested foothills. So I will say that it's 51%. That's great. Distribution matters, connectivity matters. I'll talk about that a little bit. I think Ezekiel is going to talk about that a little bit more too. But I do like this. This is pulled from our urban tree canopy assessment. It does compare to some other cities, which I'm not trying to say, hey, look, we're so far ahead. There's a lot, I mean, maybe a little bit. There's a lot of nuance to this. I do want to say there's a lot of nuance to this. Distribution, connectivity, these things really matter. We are privileged to have in our city a lot of these really awesome contiguous forest areas on the perimeter, here in, Cougar Mountain, the Squaw Mountain, the Tiger Mountain. So, but you can kind of see that a lot of the edge of our city are these big, essentially all the dark green here is tree canopy, part of that 51%, which is cool. And then you can see, some of them around the lake with Lake Savannah State Park there. And what I do like to call out, which isn't maybe as direct to some of the carnivores we're talking about today. Obviously, we talk a lot about salmon in our city, but you can make out some of the recovering riparian buffer that we've been really working along Issaquah Creek there too. Something that, I think is really neat history here, or more modern history here in Issaquah in terms of some of the restoration. So I'm not going to cover all of these right now, but there's a lot of benefits of our urban forests, why trees are important, why forests are important. Actually, all these photos were taken in and around the Pickering Reach of Issaquah Creek near Pickering Barn. So not the animals we're focusing on today, but I thought this was just kind of interesting to include. But we'll focus kind of primarily on wildlife habitat the next few slides here. History of land use, this could probably be phrased better, but essentially a lot of the deforestation is what I'm trying to kind of highlight in this slide right here. Issaquah was incorporated as a city in 1892, and we have a long history of timber coal mining, and dairy farming. So this is an aerial photo, if you can't read that, from 1946, looking over Lake Sammamish up the valley, and you can see how little tree cover exists at this point. You can see a lot of these bare patches on Cougar, or I should say Tiger and Squaw Mountains. And we'll start talking about that kind of long road to recovering some of these habitats. So yeah, creeks channelized, wetlands drain, a lot of degraded habitat, and we were still working that uphill battle to try to recover this for, you know, not only the wildlife species we're talking about, but so many other important, as Sam touched on, some of the ecosystem benefits that you know, forest streams and our kind of natural areas provide. This is another way to kind of look at that urban tree cover assessment that we have, or urban tree canopy, I should say. This is essentially the park system as part of our Green Issaquah. So that's a quick plug I want to put in. We are regularly leading volunteer events, educational events. We're kind of branding this event through Green Issaquah and, you know, work with Woodland Park Zoo, of course. But you can also see some of that stuff on the perimeters of the city. And I'm going to talk briefly in a slide or two about transfer development rights, but these big native growth protection areas that we see in some of these areas didn't happen randomly. So we'll talk about that a little bit. But yeah, we have almost 15 to 1,600 acres of forested parks and open spaces in Issaquah. It's about 20% of our land mass. So that's not including Lake Sammamish State Park, which is another 500 acres technically within the boundaries of the city of Issaquah. How did we get here? Talked about this a little bit, but I do think there's a really awesome history of land conservation from groups like Issaquah Trails Club, Mount Sasan Greenway Trust for Public Land, you know, folks working with the city, really advocating for this in the 80s, 90s when this population and area was growing quite a bit. So that history, I think, something that's really impressive. I actually saw a stat recently that we've doubled our city open space looking at that last map between 1998 and about 2020. So you can tell those kind of incremental gains, and, you know, both really focusing habitat along our salmon bearing streams and some of these forested foothills as well. So yeah, this is a coyote between two big red cedar trees at Park Point. Just kind of hanging out, I guess. So transfer development rights, I'm not going to get too hung up on this, but essentially it's the idea that, you know, we have development code in our cities that allows you to develop to certain densities, commercial, residential, or conserved areas. Sometimes developers have been allowed to develop more densely in already established areas to essentially preserve forest and open space and others. So that Talus native growth protection area is an example. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about Park Point as an example of that too. But I think a really good history of, you know, a little bit of compromise and you know, kind of making sure it's like, hey, we're going to go denser where we already have development and, you know, try to conserve these bigger forested tracts for habitat, connectivity, and you know, a bit for recreation too. And then that leads to all these properties, as you saw by that 1946 picture, aren't in the best shape. So restoration, reforestation are big goals that we're you know, working on here in the city and have been working on for a better part of a few decades. And then obviously having an educated, engaged community is a really big part of the equation too. So this is just a really quick case study for Park Point, which is 101 acres that was conserved as part of our transfer development right. I probably should have put this slide first. In the next slide, I do have a little map to get your bearings. But it's a key connection point. It's one of the most narrow points in the Issaquah Creek Valley between Tiger Mountain and Squaw Mountain. So we do see a lot of wildlife in this area. This is where we've had camera traps set up for some amount of years and get all this amazing footage. So we've done over a decade of restoration there, and we see a lot of that carnivore use. So I will play, hopefully, just really quickly, if I click on this. This mouse is terrible. We'll talk a little bit more about how Woodland Park Zoo is actually using some of this data, you know, not just in Issaquah, but the broader kind of Seattle area.
You play these.
I'm sure you're all fine watching those again. But my last slide here is really kind of going back to that Park Point. So if you kind of see here, this is that 101 acre parcel. A lot of it's behind Issaquah High School. Issaquah Hobart Road comes through here. Narrow part of the valley between Tiger and Squaw Mountains. And really good connectivity, some big other parks and open spaces we have. This is all part of Squaw Valley Park and then what we call the South Issaquah Creek Greenway. So ways for animals to get there, but obviously one of the biggest barriers is Issaquah Hobart Road. And unfortunately, we do see a fair amount of wildlife mortality there. Our park ranger Alex unfortunately has to respond to that. Often it's deer, but there's been other carnivores we've seen there too. So that's an issue, and I hope our city can get creative about ways to maybe kind of deal with that. Yeah, and I think Ezekiel will touch on, that type of work in other areas. And then I just want to call out, this is essentially the same spot in Park Point, highlighting some of the restoration, some of the trees going in, trying to reforest some of these areas that were, clear cut, usually turned into dairy farming, and we have a lot of invasive grasses, blackberry, all that stuff coming in. So just hopefully a really quick snapshot of the work we're doing here at Issaquah around restoration, conservation, and would love to chat with anyone that's interested in getting involved more. So yeah, thank you. Now we have Ezekiel Roloff, the wildlife biologist with the Snoqualmie Indian Tribe.
Hey, thanks everyone for having us. This portion of the talk is called Whose Habitat, and that is in an effort to challenge the perspective of how we are all engaging and using surrounding landscapes. Asking the question, whose habitat are we really in? So my name is Ezekiel Roloff. I'm the wildlife biologist for the Snoqualmie Tribe. This is a photo of me alone in the woods, in the wet portion of the woods, falling into an underwater beaver channel, and with no one to help me or no one to laugh. So I share with this group that can now see it and laugh with me. And now I have support. We just recently hired a wildlife technician, and she's in the audience, and claimed she was going to make an abnormal amount of eye contact with me during this presentation. If you feel like there's a stare down contest going on, there is. Great. So one question I wanted to ask at the beginning of this is coexistence a choice? And I believe Kevin made a great point about this, that some of the carnivores are doing a great job coexisting, but it's not necessarily on them. It is important to realize that as humans expand their presence into more remote areas, we are displacing them. It is our responsibility to learn how to coexist with them. Increased human connectivity often reduces habitat connectivity and leads to more wildlife conflict. Therefore, the onus is on us to be able to conduct ourselves in a manner that promotes coexistence and accepts the responsibility to respect and protect wildlife. Also, the previous presenters have done a great job rehearsing and going off the cuff with their language, but I woke up early to do a running pack test for wildland fire cards, so I'm going to be relying heavily on my notes. All right, although the perceived risk from us appears to be much greater in regards to conflict with our local carnivores, I often ask others to consider the perceived risk and realize the consequence that our wildlife are faced with from these same encounters. A dance with a spunky black bear in your driveway may give you quite a start, but if handled well, both parties are left unscathed as you return to your respective dens. As you resume your normal life, perhaps with an exhilarating bear story to tell at parties, the bear has a different story. When bears and other wildlife become too comfortable, desensitized, and habituated to seeking out opportunities among people, their story becomes shorter. Our local carnivores deserve our protection in the form of stewardship, accountability, and realizing the significance of the risk that our wildlife faces. This risk can often be avoidable and mitigated by our actions. As we move into summer and look forward to a good day in the park, maybe down by the river, picking some berries, cooling off at the lake, maybe hiking through the mountains, all of these spaces have habitat value and are prioritized by animals as well. It is important to consider the impact you may have as you occupy these landscapes. Wildlife rely heavily on these high priority habitats for forage, navigation, and mating. There are protections around some of these habitats, such as biodiversity corridors and old growth forests, but some of our smaller scale local habitats need our personal protection. Hopefully this is working perfect. Okay, so as I mentioned before, we value the same habitats as many of our wildlife species do. Although the storage unit site may not be the most glamorous for a presentation, this reel from our wildlife camera illustrates just how many species, people included, occupy the same landscapes. It is important for us to consider the seasonal and temporal scale that each of these animals use throughout the seasons. Barriers are a challenge for wildlife to access habitats necessary for their survival. Barriers can come in all forms for different species. For example, a fence might be a barrier to a deer, but might provide a grid-like highway for bobcats. A roadway may provide an easy direct path across a valley for a large predator, but may be an impassable, scalding hot, traffic-ridden patch of road for a small amphibian that is not able to cross. Many cities and towns are built in these transition landscapes that animals need to pass through, whether that's between a forest and the river, the mountains or the sound, or a rock and a hard place. Wildlife require to move through these landscapes. Understanding this movement is critical for successful coexistence. I put this wildlife pass up here. This is near the top of Snoqualmie Pass, and I'd like to highlight this for the sake of discussion. Largely, this has been a successful project, and one key component I think makes this successful is the exclusion of humans from this structure. We have similar structures in the valley. This is closer to home, closer to where we're standing today. And this one has not been so successful. This has been inundated by a lot of human uses, and we'll get into that later. So this photo is taken from that very same undercrossing in the last photo, and this is some deer hooves walking right over the top of some mountain bike trails. So this coexistence, this form of coexistence and recreation does have a significant impact on the wildlife that this structure is designed for, and really reduces the ability for wildlife to use this. So recreation along the I-90 corridor is an ever expanding and poses a significant risk to our wildlife. As recreation expands, the nexus for wildlife conflict increases. It is important to consider the impacts that you might have as you occupy the landscapes. And I urge everyone to consider recreating in the spirit of mindfulness rather than conquest. So this is a little screenshot from a story map that the tribe put together, and it dives into the details of recreation impacts in the Snoqualmie tribe ancestral lands. In the center is a QR code if anyone would like to snap a picture or bug me after the talk and I can get this information to you. This is a snippet, a study out of Montana where a collared black bear was seemingly appeared to have made 46 attempts to cross I-90. So this is a good example of what the animals, showing the intent of what these animals are trying to do. And we certainly have the capability and the tools at our disposal to help these connectivity paths be restored. The one way you all and everyone can get involved outside is jumping into some stewardship opportunities. The tribe recently completed a restoration project just downstream of where we're at right now on Tibbetts Creek. The lower section of the creek in Lake Sammamish State Park contains reaches where the creek is deeply incised, has little or no riparian canopy, and was previously choked with invasive blackberries. Since 2020, the tribe's restoration program has worked with Trout Unlimited state parks to remove invasive species, weeds, and replant native vegetation. The planted trees and shrubs will shade the creek to help cool the water temperature and provide inputs of wood and organic matter critical for juvenile salmon and other aquatic organisms. These restoration efforts often include a volunteer portion, so get involved. And if you're wondering how to get involved and also want to learn more about best practices for coexisting with various wildlife species, check out the Snoqualmie Tribe Ancestral Lands Movement on Instagram or online, or check in with the booth after this. The Ancestral Lands Movement seeks to spread awareness of the Snoqualmie people who have lived in the southern Salish Sea region since time immemorial, and share the significance of these lands and provide information on how people can help tribes in respecting, restoring, and protecting these lands. That's all.
Cool. Thanks, Ezekiel. Next, we have Katie Remind from Woodland Park Zoo talking about coexisting with carnivores and the Seattle Urban Carnivore Project, I believe. Your line's going.
Okay,
There.
great. All right, well, thank you so much, everyone, for being here this evening. I'm Katie Remind with Woodland Park Zoo. And I just really appreciate how Sam and Kevin kind of set up the wildlife that we're really focusing on today and thinking about their perspectives and how they're living their lives. And then how Dan and Ezekiel just set up for us sort of the landscape perspective and thinking about all of that context together. And now we're going to roll into sort of our, as Ezekiel said, you know, us being accountable for actions we can take to coexist with wildlife like bears and coyotes and the other awesome animals we share our spaces with. So hopefully this will kick us off into a good wrap-up session, and then I'm sure you all have questions as well. So Woodland Park Zoo has been working out here with the community of Issaquah, initially with the Issaquah schools from 2012 to 2017. And we had an awesome program with the middle schools where students investigated the carnivores they live with out here and also practiced their skills in scientific inquiry, setting up camera traps and doing investigations and coming up with their own recommendations for how to coexist with the carnivores in this area. And then that grew into a larger, broader project from 2017 to 2021 that included the city of Issaquah, as well as a number of community volunteers. So that was really excellent work. I loved, you know, I used to come out as a kid. It was my grand adventure to go to Gilman Village to go shopping with my mom. And so it was fun to kind of spend more time in Issaquah through these projects. And, you know, this community is where, you know, the urban suburban landscape meets the wild landscape. So this is all very relevant for this community. There we go. And then that project, as the focused work through some grants that we had out here in Issaquah was kind of wrapping up, Woodland Park Zoo and Seattle University launched the Seattle Urban Carnivore Project. And that project now covers kind of all of Central King County, working on understanding the carnivores that we share a landscape with and how to coexist with those species. Keep doing the wrong one there. All right, so the goals of this project are, we talk about them as these 4 goals: understanding the carnivores that we live with and share a landscape with, collaborating to engage ourselves in that understanding, collaborating in both local, national, and international research studies about urban carnivores, engaging people in the community with us in this work, and then ultimately all of that to contribute to coexistence. So the ways that we go about understanding urban carnivores, one is through wildlife camera traps that we've talked about. And we have about 45 camera traps running at any given time across a couple of transects. One that goes from kind of urban North Seattle out all the way to Duval. And then the other one kind of goes from urban South Seattle out along the Cedar River towards Maple Valley, Hobart area. And then also some areas in between, like here in Issaquah. So through those camera traps, we get hundreds of thousands of photos every year that we process into data. So those become detections of wildlife in those areas where the cameras are. So we have that data. We have an army of volunteers that help us do the work, many of them here in Issaquah. I think we have over 100 volunteers helping us manage these camera traps and wrangle that data as well. We also have Carnivore Spotter, and some of you may be familiar with this tool. This was launched as a part of the Seattle Urban Carnivore Project back in 2019. It's a place where people can share their observations of urban carnivores, including bobcats, raccoons, black bears, coyotes, cougars. And you can share if you have a photo or video or not. And we do vet all the ones that do have media. So we go through and verify the identifications of the ones that have photos or video. But this has become an amazing data set. We have, I think, over 11,500 observations thus far in our first close to 5 years. And so when we put the camera trap data and the public observations together, there's a lot we can learn and do with those 2 data sets. Also, when people submit Carnivore Spotter observations, they can submit comments. And so we're learning a lot about people's perspectives about urban carnivores, as well as the kinds of interactions that people are having, whether those are positive, whether they see those as positive interactions or negative. So this has all been really helpful data. And with that, we've been able to work with communities on these specific actions that can help us coexist with carnivores. We started this work with community volunteers here in Issaquah when we were working on that specific project out here. And this happened right during the pandemic. And so we kind of went online, but we had some great meetings, did some great work together. And some of you may have seen these yard signs around the community. These were developed with community volunteers here and Woodland Park Zoo staff. During the pandemic, it was like, well, everyone's out walking around, so let's make yard signs. But we kind of boiled down those messages, you know, what are things that people, what are the most important things people can do to coexist? And I will say the most important point is that we do them as a community. You know, you could do all the right things yourself, but unless your neighbors are with you in that, you know, it's not going to work. So it does, and that's hard work. But it does take working together as a community. And so all of these messages I'll share, these are things that we would like to help you share with your neighbors as well. I'm guessing that because you're here, you're probably, you know, already doing a lot of these things and on board with this. But the hard part is like, how do we kind of make it a community effort? So the main one really is preventing access to human-derived food sources. There's a whole bunch of other little messages or actions that can go underneath that, and they're gonna vary depending on your context. You know, do you have a pet or not? Do you have chickens? You know, that kind of thing. But really the key is just preventing access to human-derived food sources. So some of those specific actions are things like storing your garbage indoors or using wildlife-resistant cans. Placing your can outside on the morning of garbage pickup. I think that one's easier said than done sometimes. I talked with some of the 6th graders when we had that middle school program, and they had in mind a robot trash can that would take itself out. And I was like, that is brilliant. Like, do that. Because it's hard. You know, it's hard to get up that early in the morning sometimes, or maybe you have other things going on you need to do. But that is a really important one. Also feeding pets indoors and not leaving that feed outside. I think sometimes people feel like they're doing wildlife a favor by providing them some extra food sources. I think we all know that typically is not helpful for wildlife. And so how can we help people understand that mindset that if you really care about the wildlife, actually not providing them food is the best choice. The other point is to keep your pets safe. And there are different ways to do that, again, depending on the context you're in. Having dogs on a leash when you're recreating in your neighborhood is really important. Keeping cats indoors unless you have something like a catio where they can get some time outside. Or I know some cats who like being on a harness and being outside. That's another option. Keeping them inside at night is also a great strategy. So there's a lot of different ways we can keep our pets safe as well. And then my third tip is called humane hazing. So we learned from Sam about the fact that if coyotes become too comfortable or become habituated, then that's when conflicts can start to happen. And I will say all the actions that I'm talking about are actions that are appropriate for what we might think of as shared spaces or more people spaces. You know, a lot of us go out and recreate as well, and there's other actions that you can take for that, but really thinking about in our yards, in our neighborhoods, in our communities that we share with wildlife, there's some spaces that are, you know, more people spaces. And in those spaces, humane hazing is an option. So what that means, what that kind of looks like, is if there's a coyote that you feel is getting too bold, getting too comfortable in, say, your backyard, you can do things like bang on metal things or shake keys. You can yell, you can clap, and just making the animal feel uncomfortable and making the animal understand that this is not a place for them to be spending time. And I think Ezekiel was pointing out, and we were chatting leading up to this panel, that what's important is that it's a novel experience for the animal. And so you can't just keep doing the same thing over and over either. So you can't, necessarily set up an automatic, thing that's going to like bang a pot, or something like that. It's got to kind of surprise the animal. This is also an option for bears. Bears can also react to humane hazing. So that's a strategy that you can use if it's a people space and the animal is, and this is going to be subjective. Everyone's going to have a different sense of when this is the appropriate thing to do. Where it wouldn't be appropriate, Sam was talking about how coyotes will escort people away from their dens. Right where a coyote has a den would not be a place that you would haze a coyote, because they kind of claim that space, right? So we want to be thoughtful about how we do this, but this is definitely an option. And then the last point I want to make, I haven't been involved in developing any kind of outreach materials about this, but I found this great one online by the artist Lily Chin. You may not realize this, but when we use chemicals to kill pests like rats, just like we learn about food chains, those chemicals kind of go up through the food chain and can really affect. There have been various studies about how they affect bobcats, owls, and other raptors, and possibly also coyotes and raccoons. So, and it kind of makes sense. Sam talked about how coyotes are natural rodent control. So if we let them do their thing, then we won't need those chemical means. But we feel strongly that finding alternatives to those chemical controls, it will be very helpful to our native carnivore population. That can be exclusion, just keeping things out of your house. There's also some new alternatives that are hormone-based, so it's like rat birth control. And those are some new options that are catching on and have been really well researched and are very effective. So fortunately, we have some new options as well for that. So those are some of my top tips for coexisting. I'm sure we have questions about other, challenges that you all have had that we can get into, but I wanted to share those. First and foremost, and we do have a lot of these resources on our webpage at zoo.org/coexisting. We just recently developed some posters with support from the Snoqualmie tribe and input from a lot of partners around the community, including Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, with some coexistence messages. One specifically for coyotes and one that's more for general wildlife. And we have those available with Lachute Seed Animal translations on them. We also have them in Spanish, Russian, Vietnamese, and Chinese. So we have some of those posters back in the back if you want to take a look. And if you want to take a few to post up somewhere in your community, we have a few available to hand out. So thanks so much for being here tonight. And I will pass it off to Alex.
Thank you, Katie. And then, last but not least, our Issaquah Park Ranger, Alex Anderson, is going to kind of continue the coexistent tip theme here. And then we should have a little time for questions and, time to kind of chat as a group. So Alex, take us away.
Well, hi, everybody. My name is Alex Anderson. I'm the City of Issaquah Park Ranger. I get kind of the dubious honor of going last. So I'm going to be reiterating a lot of points we've already talked about today. So please try to stay awake if you can. First off, I'm just going to start real briefly, kind of going over the park ranger program here in Issaquah. We patrol and monitor about 1,800 acres of publicly owned lands, lands that are owned by the city. So those can be, your parks, your downtown parks, forested open space like Dan was talking about, and also conservation areas, whether that's, native growth conservation, or just natural resources, that kind of thing. We currently have one full-time ranger, which is myself. And then we have a seasonal ranger who is active from April through October, so kind of our busy summer season. That being said, there's only one of us usually, so we have a lot of responsibility, and a lot of ground to cover. We're very busy. I don't like to necessarily start off conversations talking about what we aren't, but the term park ranger means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. It is kind of a term that's been watered down through various roles that park rangers may take based on their jurisdiction. So we aren't animal control officers, we aren't fish and wildlife officers or game wardens, and we aren't commissioned law enforcement here in the city of Issaquah. So we can't write you a ticket, we can't arrest you, we don't have any law enforcement authority. We primarily focus on education. So we focus really on providing education to the public, whether that's just more broadly in cases like this, but also in kind of more acute circumstances when education is needed for mitigation for conflict. So we do respond to a lot of human wildlife conflict, whether that's bears digging through garbage cans or a deer that's been hit on the side of the road, that kind of thing. And we do provide as much assistance as we're able to provide. So as we've kind of talked about earlier today, human wildlife conflict is primarily due to human encroachment into wildlife habitat, right? So wildlife can only follow their drives and their instincts. They're not being malicious necessarily. They're doing what they're doing, right? Bear's got a bear is the term I like to use. So we as humans kind of have the onus falls on us, the responsibility falls on us to make good choices. And to really be intentional about how we interact with these animals. And a big point that I really like to hammer home is that the presence of wildlife should be viewed as a privilege of living in this area rather than a source of fear and anxiety, right? We should feel lucky that we're able to interact with these creatures. These creatures are still present in this area as opposed to your more urban areas where they might not be. And we really want to do what we can to preserve this sort of coexistence balance. So this is kind of my, I don't know how much you can read the text in the way back there, but this is my very unscientific sort of way of looking at the work that we do as rangers. So we kind of start out at the top here with public education. So opportunities like this when we reach out to the public, and so sort of the goal of that is to dispel myths and misinformation that may draw people to wrong conclusions about these types of issues. And hopefully in dispelling those myths and misinformation, we sort of foster a sense of empathy, or at the very least, a sense of awareness, right? You don't necessarily need to be empathetic, but you just need to be aware of the issues and aware of sort of the right courses of action to mitigate these conflicts. With that empathy or an awareness comes a coexistence mindset. So that's what we're kind of trying to foster here again. And then that mindset leads to appropriate responses, right? So appropriate responses to these conflicts or potential conflicts. And then we start all over again, right? We're always constantly learning, the science is changing, data is changing, stuff like that. So it's kind of this circle. Again, this is something that I've made up. This is not scientific in any sense, but that's how I look at the work that we do. Oh, and that is backwards. There we go. So in dealing with a lot of the sort of wildlife conflict that we see, in this area, we get sort of some kind of common reactions to certain things, especially folks who aren't used to living in this area. Some folks who are coming from maybe a major city and they're moving out to this area for the first time and they're just not used to seeing these sorts of animals near their house, right? Mm-hmm. So there's this sense of they're not supposed to be here, get them away from me. I don't care how you do it, just I don't want to see it, right? Which is not, not necessarily the attitude we want to have, right? So we get a lot of like, well, why don't you just shoot them all, right? Or I don't want you to hurt it, but just trap it and relocate it somewhere else, right? Just get it away from me, right? Or you got to do something because it's only a matter of time before it's going to attack me or my kids or my pet, right? And not to, we're not trying to belittle those fears. We're not trying to sort of like look down on those fears, be condescending about it. But we just want to kind of temper those reactions a little bit with sort of more of the data behind it, right? So when we talk about lethal removal, we talk about lethal removal in very, very limited individual circumstances, right? the sort of broad, indiscriminate, lethal control that we talk about is not effective. If anything, it usually has the opposite effect of increasing population. So that's something that kind of is a good way to push back on that initial reaction. And while people think that relocation is often more humane, ultimately it usually just results in the animal dying somewhere else because it's going to try to go back to where it was initially captured, and that usually is not successful for that animal. So, and as I said, the euthanasia and relocation just generally have counterproductive effects. So those aren't really, good options for a lot of these creatures. As I said, populations do rebound quickly, and there's that ensuing lack of competition for resources when we look at those options just generally results in increased populations, and sometimes even more conflict because we're getting new creatures into the area who aren't as habituated and could be a source of even more conflict. Animal attacks, especially unprovoked animal attacks, are extremely rare. People tend to think that they're a lot more common than they actually are. And in many attacks are linked to human behavior. So intentional feeding, stuff like that. So again, it kind of comes back to, we need to make good choices as the human beings versus blaming animals for our choices, right? So Brianna briefly talked about humane hazing. I'm going to kind of go into a little bit more detail because people like to have sort of action items like plans, so if you do encounter one of these animals, we do recommend humane hazing for a sort of a limited band of circumstances. We don't want to haze animals that are in their natural habitat just existing, right? That's not the point of hazing. Hazing is designed to sort of be territorial about human spaces, and to reduce the possibility or likelihood of conflict, right? So the intent is to show habituated coyotes that they're not welcome in an area. We're reserving these for sensitive areas like playgrounds or parks or backyards, places where coyotes are not supposed to be, right? And a big thing with hazing is to remember, obviously we talked about those sort of sensitive times of the year when coyotes are denning. You might not want to be hazing during those times necessarily. We always want to leave an escape route. So we don't want to trap the animal. We don't want to put it in a position where it feels like it needs to defend itself, right? So some ways you can do hazing. First of all, you never want to turn your back or run. You don't want to present sort of that prey image to the coyote. You want to stand your ground, get big, get loud, shout, stomp your feet, use noisemakers. If you need to throw objects like rocks or ultimately use something like bear spray as a deterrent, you can do that as well. But the big thing with hazing too is you need to commit to your actions. You can't just kind of do it half-heartedly. You really need to make sure you're driving that coyote or that animal out of that area, right? That's the whole point of being territorial about your space. We did talk a little bit briefly about the novelty item in terms of making sure that hazing is novel to the creature. It may have encountered these tactics in the past, so you may need to vary things up. It may need to be repeated multiple times, or it may just need to be sort of different each time you do it to make sure it's effective. So we did talk about bear aware, we are bear country, and we've talked kind of almost at length about the different ways that we can sort of coexist more effectively with black bears. I'll just kind of really briefly go over, you want to make sure that you're limiting human food sources, and also just making sure that we're keeping our dogs on leash, whether that's in our parks or on our trails. It is for a reason, right? It is so the dog does not go out, harass the wildlife, and then bring the mad wildlife back to you, right? That's what we want to try to avoid. Intentional feeding, we tend to think of unintentional feeding, right? So that's like you left your garbage can out, the bear got into it, that's unintentional feeding, right? Or if you want to be really strict about it, you could call that negligent feeding, I guess. But intentional feeding is when we have people actually leaving food out for these animals, thinking that they're benefiting them, right? We have seen cases of this in Issaquah, both intentional coyote feeding, as well as intentional coyote feeding that has escalated into unintentional bear feeding. So it's important to remember that when you do have maybe neighbors or family members who are leaving food out for these animals, you can't control who's eating that food or who's drawn to that food, right? You can't selectively feed. So it's important to remember that that has larger effects than you may be anticipating. While it's often really well intentioned, I'll use that in big air quotes, it's overwhelmingly negative for the animal. Generally, people are not feeding these animals what they need to be fed. They're creating a dependence, and they're also just fostering that sort of opportunity for conflict, right? So we definitely do not want to do that. And as if you needed another reason to not do it, it's also a crime in the state of Washington to feed large carnivores, to include bears. So please don't do it. Please don't do it. That's all. I'm just going to try to hammer that one home. And yeah, just to kind of wrap up, we've talked about different ways to kind of engage with these simple steps, but yeah, we want to limit potential food sources in various forms. We want to control our pets, and then we want to haze humanely when necessary. So that is my short and sweet presentation. These are my contact points. If you have issues in your neighborhood with stuff like this, please don't hesitate to reach out either by email or phone. We also have the parkrangers@issaquah.gov. That's a general email that goes out to both me and Dan and our seasonal ranger. So thanks for your attention. Yeah.
So we are a little past our time, and hopefully a lot of questions you might have been answered. Are you all good? Maybe we'll take just one or two questions, and if people can stick around for a little bit, I also be mindful a lot of folks live in the Seattle area, have commutes, so I do want to get our panelists and anyone else on their journey home this evening here in a little bit. But any burning questions?
Okay, Sam. So what is it when the coyotes are howling? Is it a kill? What is it?
They're just talking to each other. A lot of the time, that's like family members communicating with each other. It's not, they don't have a kill. That's a common misconception.
Yeah, okay.
It usually sounds like a lot more of them than there actually are. We overestimate it by like 3 times the amount of, just by the acoustics.
Okay.
Yeah, they're talking.
Thank you.
Do they hunt in packs like wolves?
They can. They can also hunt individually. So they're very adaptable. If it helps them to hunt together, they will. If it doesn't, they'll hunt solitarily. In urban areas, usually it's pretty solitary because they're taking down small prey, and it's not going to help to have 2 coyotes try and take down a rabbit. So.
And we tend to think of them, just a terminology thing. We tend to think of coyotes as living more in like family groups than packs. They don't kind of have that same social structure that wolves do. So if it's a few coyotes together, it's usually some kind of family group.
Okay, I was thinking of deer rather than rabbits.
Yeah.
Question?
What should I do with a bear?
We have bears that live near our house, so he has a question like what he should do as a small child, like for like the hazing and stuff like that. If he's smaller and might be playing in the yard, what should he do?
That's a great question.
Yeah, that's a.
Okay.
Good question. So what you want to do if you see a bear is you want to put your hands up and you want to stay where you are. You want to say, hey bear, really loud, okay? And that lets your dad and your family and everybody else know that there's a bear back there and they want to come out and pick you up and do the same thing. Just make lots of noise, clap, look big, and try not to run away. I know that's hard, but if you're close to the house and you can jump in the house real quick, that's also great too. So.
Is it okay for him to walk backwards slowly? Is that okay?
Yeah. Most of the bears that are in these urban or semi-urban environments are again learning to live with us. We're not on the menu. They really want to avoid us for in most circumstances. But they're looking for our attractants. So the biggest things we could do to keep bears from coming onto our properties and sticking around our properties is identifying and removing those attractants. So bird feeders, garbage cans, barbecues, and chickens are the top calls I get. The biggest concern when bumping into a bear or human contact with bears is those unintentional or surprise encounters. So when you're walking out to the trash can early in the morning or going out to feed the chickens and there's a bear sleeping behind the tree and then you surprise each other. That's most of the cases there, so.
It seems maybe just the next door phenomenon, but it seems that in the last 2 years, there has been a significant increase in reports of bobcats in the area. I mean, a lot more reports of sightings and so on. And related to that is what kills more domestic cats, coyotes or bobcats? Because we've seen them walking down the street with cats in their mouth.
Oh, yeah.
It's, people let their cats out. But what's with bobcats?
I have a comment on the first part, and this is total theory. I don't know for sure. But so many more people have, Ring cameras and backdoor. I feel like I've seen a lot more sightings just because people are finally seeing the bobcat that came through their yard every night for the last 10 years, but they only see it now because of those. So I don't know for sure, but a lot because I review all the reports that come into Carnivore Spotter. And so there's just so many of the bobcat ones are those security cams. So that could be part of that.
I'll add that a lot more people are working from home. So your chances of seeing something walk through your backyard is higher.
Yeah, very true.
Thank you. Does anyone have a quick thought on the domesticated cats and bobcats? I personally don't, but in terms of.
I don't know anything.
I just want to add an opinion that also cats should be indoors because they're also killing birds. So
Jamie, that's a good point. Thank you.
I know you wear like bear bells when you're out hiking in bear country, but is there any recommendation of if you're at home having some kind of bell on your back door when you open it to go to your trash can or something similar so it's easy for them to?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and thank you for that. And I what I really recommend is if you well, let me ask you a couple questions first. Who here has seen a bear? Okay. Who here lives next to a green belt? So if you live next to a green belt and you see bears, you're in bear country. So when you're going outside, especially at night or early in the morning, late in the evening, go outside and make some noise. Put a bell on your door, clap your hands, honk your car a couple times on your way out. That lets the bear know that you're, one, human moving around, and two, that you're coming out. If you have pets and let them out at night, my dog looks like a little bear, but I turn a light on. I'm like, hey cows, hey bear, clap a couple times, like go potty, like make some noise when you're going out there. That just lets the wildlife know that you're human and that you're going to be out there moving around, giving them a chance to kind of, tuck away and get away from you.
It also keeps your neighbors away from you too.
We'll take one more over. Yeah.
If there's one thing you could do to positively impact the lives of wild animals in this area.
Is it food attractants? Yeah.
Why doesn't Issaquah put locks on every garbage can?
Well, that's why we have Recology, which is our waste provider. It is the ownership is a little bit on the residents too. I'm not trying to put it back there, but it costs a little bit more, but honestly, the cost. Exactly. So we're going to try to do more education events like this, try to put that out there. I know there was a little bit, in talking to Lauren and Joey, where these cans were a little harder to track down, especially in the pandemic when everything was kind of a supply issue. That's not the case anymore. So I think each one teach one. I mean, you try to do it not in a condescending way, but we need to be talking to our neighbors, talking to our community, and really advocating for this, I think. So I don't know, anyone else want to?
I think, we've talked a bit about just sort of that coexistence mindset, and people, coming around to that idea that, and I always like Sam's point that we've tried, to not coexist and it doesn't work. So how can we kind of adjust ourselves to say, yeah, it means making some changes on my part and doing some things that might be a little harder to do, but they're going to allow us, we want to meet our needs and thrive, but how can we do that in a way that lets wildlife meet their needs and thrive too? So I think that coexistence mindset, helping to encourage that is helpful.
Maybe one or two more. We're kind of running up on time here, but Dave in the back there?
Excuse me, I was late getting here. You might have addressed the carnivore in the news, the cougar. I get out exploring trails or that kind of thing, and I'm thinking about that a lot more after the incident we had out in the city.
Kevin, do you want to,
Sure. Are you speaking of the recent article from Seattle, Magnolia?
The ladies that were bike riding?
Oh, sure. Yeah, was there a specific question or concern? Just want me to address it?
yeah, address cougars in general or whatever.
Yeah, just like bears, Washington is cougar country. It's a native carnivore species here. Cougars are territorial animals. And so they're self-regulating in their densities, but we do at times see movements of younger animals or subadults. When you're out recreating, just like at home, I think the number one thing you could do is let the animals know that you're moving around, that you're out there. So like bells on your bike, bring back the little ding ding like you used to have. Horns on bikes. If you're moving fast, I know for myself when I'm riding, I'm not saying, hey bear, like I am when I'm hiking. I'm chugging air trying to stay alive, right? Those women are incredible. I had an opportunity to meet them. They did everything right. And it was just a chance encounter. But again, these incidents are extremely rare. They're extremely rare. Our cougar population is stable and normal. I hope it doesn't discourage anybody from recreating outside. But it's good to just have a conversation on how to do that safely. So again, we have great resources here as a community, as well as, Fish and Wildlife website and others is safe recreating and living in cougar country. We'll have a ton of good resources for you.
I think Kevin did a great job answering that question, but one point I heard from you in the back there, that it's in your mind more now since you saw the article. And I think as residents around here, it should always be in your mind. You should always have a level of situational awareness about you when you're recreating outdoors, and be prepared for those encounters, but recognize that they do happen, whether or not they're in the news or not. So you should always have that situational awareness.
Brianna?
I was just looking at things like something we as residents can do. I'm not in Issaquah, I'm in Seattle, but we're looking on our comprehensive plan right now, sort of like predicting what we'll need 20 years in the future. And I'm gonna be trying to comment on it, but as you all develop Issaquah, as you live here, you can comment on those less exciting things. Like going out to a restoration party is super exciting and fun and tangible. But like commenting on those kind of things and advocating for that zoning that Dan was talking about, like getting that density of us like sacrificing sort of that maybe American dream of we all have a yard, we all have our own house. That's lovely, but if we want to be able to live here and let them have their houses too, their own dens, then I think that's a big mind shift we're going to have to make as people. Like how much space do we need? And how closely can we coexist with our neighbors so that they can coexist with us? That's like something I think we can do. It's not as pretty and fun to talk about. It's really important.
Some people amplifying that back there, but okay. I do think, thank you so much all for the questions. We are getting, and I want to leave just a few minutes for people to still kind of be at their tables, chat with folks that want to stick around. But huge thank you to our panel. I learned so much from it.